40k has changed a lot over the last few months, and that is simply because of the transition from 8th edition to 9th edition. Blowing your opponent to smithereens is, while admittedly still a lot of fun, not quite as effective as it used to be. And in this video I'm going to be giving you a simple checklist to go through at the start of your turn, which will hopefully help you to think about the process of things to do in your turn, play the objectives a little bit better, and optimise your point scoring. So why has playing the objectives become so important? Well, I think there are a few reasons. For example, firstly, the way points are scored in a game has completely changed. If you think about ITC and those sorts of things, there's a bit of a mix between objectives and killing and those sorts of things. Now, the objectives score you a lot of points. Holding one, mostly sometimes two objectives will score you 5, you can get 10 points, hold more, you're going to get that full 15. When you're only really trying to get to 90, 15 points in a turn is a huge percentage of that. On top of that, the secondaries, they can be quite hard to max out depending on how you've built your army, how your opponent has built their army. This all builds up to the fact that objectives are going to score you the points needed to win the game. Secondly, the games are now only 5 turns. Doesn't seem to be a huge difference, but it really is. Beforehand you could build an army list which would kind of be about killing your opponent quickly, and by turn 3 you've done all the damage and then you could catch up at the end of the game. That's what my old Necrons list was. It was just lots of vehicles, try and blow your opponent up. Now you don't have time to catch up. A perfect example of that is the Custodies list that I play. The amount of times I've got that lead and then kind of the opponent has started to drag their way back as I've lost more and more models, and if the game had gone to turn 6 I would have definitely lost, but because it was only turn 5 I was able to play that mission and just hold out. On top of all this, you've got the fact that now the rules are recommending a lot more terrain. This kind of means that you're able to hide as long as you've got the terrain on the board, and those armies which will just blow you away can't see you. Therefore their killing power is reduced, you're able to hang around a lot longer and you're able to rack up those points. So we've established that we want to be focusing on the mission and playing those objectives. I'm now going to give you 4 really simple things which you're probably going to be thinking, well, these are obvious, okay? But if you think about each one of these in turn at the start of your turn, then it just gives you a good framework on what to do in terms of the planning of your actions and your movements. So number 1, the obvious one. Where can you get to in terms of your objectives near you? What can you reach? That's obviously the first thing. Okay, and then secondly, what can you actually get onto there? Especially on your first turn, maybe even on your second turn, there are going to be some objectives which are relatively unguarded, and you could go put that small little unit on there, that quick little unit, and you get to grab that objective. You're not going to be holding that objective this time in your next turn because your opponent will have wiped that off. So you need to be thinking, what objectives can I get to? Which objectives can I hold on to for an entire turn? And if that's not going to happen, how can I double up on those objectives? Okay, putting that 10-man blob of cultists on the objective could well hurt you when actually all you had to do was get an additional support on there. I would always recommend trying to have at least 2 units on your backfield objectives, although it does depend on what your opponent can bring. But especially as you start moving up the board, try and just have, it's as simple as making sure that vehicle is now just also touching onto that objective, so that if your opponent wants to try and kill the vehicle or the troops, they've got to try and do both to cancel out those 5 points. So secondly, we are also going to be obviously thinking about our secondaries. You've only got 3, so what you want to be thinking is, which ones can I tick off this turn? However, you also need to be thinking, am I going to be overextending to achieve these? A classic one is engage in all fronts. Desperate to get those 3 points, get into all 4 quarters, and then actually you end up throwing away points because you haven't been able to support those units, you're going to lose them, and in the long run you're going to not be able to score the engage that you want to. So think of your objectives, what are you going to be able to achieve with them, but also think 2-3 turns ahead, are you still going to be able to play those? We'll probably do a separate video on specific secondaries, but one little tip, which is quite a useful one: deploy scramblers. It's a very popular one, 10 points if you're able to complete an action in your deployment in the middle of the board and your opponent's deployment. I think the classic thing to do would be to just think, oh, I'll just deploy in my deployment zone turn 1. Actually, where possible, try and deploy turn 1 in the mid board. Shooting from your infantry, turn 1, highly unlikely to be effective. You'd much rather trade that 1 or 2 dead models from the enemy for the fact that you can tick that off, get them into cover, get that objective or that action done, so that you're always going to be able to deploy in your own deployment zone. That's nice and easy, and then you've only got to focus on the one in your opponent's zone. That's just a little thing there for you. But yeah, we've now thought about our own objectives. How can we double up on that? We've now thought about, what about our objectives? So, number 3, which is, of course, we now need to think about our opponent. I think when you first start playing the game, your gut instinct is to go, right, that's big and scary, let's try and kill it. How can I kill it? But actually, in these short 5-turn games, that's not going to be particularly important. What you need to be thinking about is, I know how I'm scoring my points, how can I reduce their points? So, we're going to look at their primary objectives. Have they left a small 5-man unit on an objective? Can I take that out? Have they actually left a space open for me to move, charge, get in there, so then I can wipe them out and then take control of that objective myself? It's so useful because people so often leave objectives not particularly guarded. So I've often used that to big effect, and to be honest, that's actually the first thing I do think of quite a lot. I think, right, where are they? Where are their objectives? Are there any weaknesses? Okay, so that's number 3. Think about your opponent's objectives and which ones can you knock them off to try and start taking away those 5 points from them. And finally, number 4, I'm sure you've worked it out by now, think about your opponent's secondaries. This can be going on from the very beginning of the game. You know, if you know that they have picked something to target, for example killing your characters or anything like that, you can always consider trying to put them in deep strike, dropping them in turn 3, only giving your opponent a certain amount of time to get to them. But in terms of kind of turn by turn, you want to be thinking, well, they're going to try and kill, let's say, my vehicles. Can I position my vehicles so that I can get shooting from them to hurt my opponent, but at the same time not allow their big stuff that will hurt my big stuff to get to me? So those sorts of things, which if you just have that clear-minded approach, could make a big difference. It could also be things like engage on all fronts. I've definitely played games where the opponent is kind of in their own backfield, and then they're sending off one unit, maybe he's trying to get up into a quarter or 2. Are you able to, even though they're not a dangerous unit, are you able to deal with them? Because if you do deal with them, you're immediately removing points scoring potential from your opponent for the next 2-3 turns, which will have a lasting impact. Okay, so just, are there any ways you can reduce the way they're going to score? I think that's one of those little things which isn't an instinctive thing to look at, but do know that by hindering your opponent from scoring, you're actually therefore improving the difference between your 2 scores, which is of course what we want to be doing. So there you have it. There are 4 key kind of things to think about. We want to be thinking about your primary objectives, you want to be thinking about your secondary objectives, you want to be thinking about, can you knock your opponents off any of their primary objectives, and then can you put a spanner in the works for any of their secondary plans. Where can you see examples of these sorts of things? I think on our channel we have got a few battle reports, some of which do actually do that really well. If you check out our Custodies versus Death Guard one, there is a very clear dynamic of one side getting blown off the board. However, they literally just focus on the objectives, and firstly scoring their points, and secondly denying the opponent. There's some very good clear examples of that, and hopefully you can get a really good vibe of how you can be getting your ass kicked really if someone was to come in and watch the battle, but actually still managing a reasonably strong victory. So are there any exceptions to this? Obviously sometimes you're going to set up and it's going to be very clear that you need to kill your opponent's certain model, otherwise you're going to lose the game. However, I would still recommend, with only 5 turns in play, to be thinking, okay, well, I still need to do my 4 things off my checklist. I still need to be making sure I'm scoring to my full potential. And then you can think tactically, you know, how can I hold up that opponent's unit, stop them from causing all the devastation, you know. The Nightbringer for the Necrons at the moment is obviously quite a powerful unit. But if for 4 turns he's just feeding on cheap 10-man guard units, then actually he's not being a threat. So you can, that can be a secondary thing of, well, how am I going to deal with that? But you do still need to be focusing on your scoring and your opponent's scoring, because at the end of the day, that's how the game is won and lost. So there you have it. There's just a simple kind of checklist for you to have in the back of your mind, go through it at the start of each turn, and I can assure you it will just help to make things a bit clearer for you, really. In the long run, that's what we want to be doing. We want to be making these things kind of instinctive, but if it helps you to lay it out in that 4-step approach, then I hope it helps. Please let me know how you get on in the comments, or if you have any things that you think also that I may have not mentioned, offer advice to other players. That's the kind of thing we want to be doing, building a nice supportive community here. And thank you for taking the time to watch. See you soon.